to you, Alexis.
Cheers. Thank you so much. Cool. Just noting the time. Perfect. Yeah, thank you. My name's Alexis Davin. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bristol. I'm really sad I can't be with you. I've had COVID for the last week, and hey, I got my first negative test today. So it's neither here nor there, but I'd love to be there with you in person. Sadly, I cannot be. So yeah, let's get into it. My talk is on basically someone who's neither a Marxist nor a member of the Pitt School, but rubs up against both in interesting ways. So hopefully this is a good venue to do this kind of project in. So I'm going to start roughly by outlining I will say this talk is kind of scuffed relative to where I'd hope it would be, but hope it'll pass all right. My hope is to outline Haslanger's broad project, firstly, talk about how she gets from a theory of practice to a theory of ideology, basically why it doesn't work, and bridge from there to talking about Joseph Rouse's theory of practice, which should give us some hints as to how we might get from Haslanger's project towards a more full theory of ideology coming out of a roughly pragmatist or at least practice-oriented philosophy. All right, so Sally Haslanger, for anyone who isn't familiar with her, is an analytic philosopher and later critical theorist. Her original work has historically just been straight up analytic metaphysics, but focusing as her career has progressed more and more on social construction, social objects and social ontology like race and gender, and then latterly a move towards very explicitly like institutionally aligning herself with the sort of inheritors of Frankfurt School critical theory, which means that her work has started taking up in an analytic vernacular problems of social theory, like praxis, like political action and so on. She's got a quite interesting and distinctive theory of ideology, which is backstopped by a theory of social practice. So to start off with, I've got to outline that theory of social practice. So just quoting straight from an article of hers, social practices are patterns of learned behavior that enable us to coordinate as members of a group in creating, distributing, managing, maintaining, and eliminating a resource due to mutual responsiveness to each other's behavior and the resource in question, as interpreted through shared meanings and cultural schemas. So let's unpack this a bit. 3 parts here: resource, mutual responsiveness, and these shared schemas. So firstly, what is a resource? Actually, let me just stay on that for a while. So pretty much everything is a candidate to be a resource, given everything could be, in Haslanger's terming, a bearer of positive or negative evaluation or disvaluation. And from this positive or negative valuation, we basically have social coordination problems. We have ways of trying to figure out how to give people the things they want and need based on how they value them. Which means these sort of shared meanings and cultural schemas are essentially these sorts of the cognitive elements. They're the collective judgments we make about what these valuations are and therefore what we should do about them. The world gives us so many things with which to do stuff, with which to like treat as resources and allocate in certain ways. Thinking on a very expansive list: rain, medication, cat, time, care. Spread in Haslanger's like analytic all the way from the non-material to the material, from the like very concrete to the very abstract. But all of them, we have judgments about how we value them and judgments about what practices best coordinate them. So it's beneficious to us to collect rain to water a garden maybe, but not beneficious to play baseball in the rain. And we also therefore build apparatuses on top of these practices. So like we might like to keep cats at home. So we develop tools, systems of production, activities around the keeping of cats as things we want and value in our homes. But also material objects enter into this. The materiality of the object decides which practices work, which don't work. So it's a great idea to keep a cat home, not so great to keep a panther, for example. So these shared meanings and cultural schemas are what build what she calls a cultural techne, which is a way of navigating the social world through this sort of system of valuation and adjusting our practices in real time according to how these practices dynamically interact with our objects. It's clear to her, though, that these judgments peel apart from the like exact nature of the objects in peculiar ways. And one of these is in very explicitly Marxian terms here. So here's a quote from her article spelling this out. For example, many have argued that unregulated capitalism encourages a flattening of value. The only value is exchange value, so the value of anything is its value in the market. We know this to be false, and this is why we impose restrictions on the market. One cannot sell body parts or fluids, children or captives into slavery, because human beings and their bodies have a different sort of value than commodities. So it's clear that like the value that she's talking about here is this very broad orientational thing. Like if the practices can range from playing baseball to possessing a cat to whether you sell organs, like the senses of value and how we're oriented the object clearly cannot be reducible to something like exchange value. But this quote itself might, I don't know, tip off a few people, might be some alarm bells. We'll come back to it shortly. The third notion that I want to come to is responsiveness, which is Haslanger's first bridge to the work of Joseph Rouse. Rouse I'll get into in slightly more detail later, but broadly he spent a large part of his career outlining a theory of particularly scientific practice. And if it's a good account of scientific practice, it seems to generalize into other sorts of practices quite well. And the element Haslanger takes from Rouse specifically is the idea of responsiveness. So this is a quote she drags. The bounds of practice are identified by the ways in which its constitutive performances bear upon one another. One performance expresses a response to another, for example, by correcting it, rewarding it, or punishing its performer, drawing inferences from it, translating it, imitating it, circumventing its effects, and so on. Haslanger uses this to conclude that practices are more normatively bounded than mere regularities, but don't necessarily involve full-blown judgment about the appropriateness or correctness of an association of a practice. And there are obviously counterexamples to this, like you could think of a certification exam for a profession, or a peer review process is like a very explicit certification or a validation of a process or otherwise. But clearly there are all of these other ways where normative import is given to the other parts of practice, like the other participants practicing or like having some sorts of activity that bear normatively on instances of the practice. And this is how the bounds of the practice are negotiated and judged and maintained. And what you'll notice here should be at least a very Brandomy flavor to Rouse's account of practice. They're very, very close together with some minor and probably, for the purpose of this talk, pretty inconsequential differences between the two. So, okay, cool. Hopefully we're on the same page with an account of practice. How do we get to an account of ideology? Very simply for Haslanger, ideology is cultural techne gone wrong. It is when cultural estimations of the value and disvalue of resources organize us around those resources in ways that are unjust or that don't actually recognize the way that we should value those objects, the way that we recognize what is a value or what is not a value. And this is a specifically pejorative sense of ideology, basically developed on the back of Raymond Geuss's distinctions between these sorts of descriptive and pejorative senses of how you might use the term. And clearly this is a thing that we can point to talk about broadly how we build social practice and institutions which manage these practices, which contain misallocation of resources, bad distributions obviously, like maintain systems and institutions which legislate for coercion and so on. Broadly, it makes sense as a sort of a first pass of like what you might want to do with a theory of practice that she's outlined for herself. I think there should be a couple of things that should be obvious off the bat here. The first is a sort of slip between qualitative and quantitative. So the initial statements of a theory of practice and theory of cultural techne very much explicitly talk about this as being relations of value and disvalue, which is, I'm not going to say problematic, but at least it leaves very open the bridge between how you might bridge from those to what sorts of practices get taken up. Include the materiality of the object is sort of where this is like shuffled off to. Like it's very hard to simply talk about exchange value if you're talking about the practice of baseball or the practice of keeping a pet. But it's very hard to cash out like how you translate from positive or negative valuation to like what the practices might be. Quite clearly practices are revisable, they're negotiable, and like that's not going to be determined explicitly by the nature of this valuation structure. But as long as we have this commitment simultaneously, that ideology is not like a bunch of declarative sentences, but also the schema for valuation is simply like positive or negative. We've got a sort of bridge to jump between. What you might personally, I sort of get the sense that what we get stuck with is an inability to actually use this concept of ideology to do some of the basic tasks we hope for ideology. One example might be that sort of critique of the market that I talked about earlier. To the extent that like marketizing or commoditizing certain things is a bad idea, we might be able to talk about like why specific commodities like cause problems distributionally when we put them on the market, but we won't get to the like core problem of like why it's a problem that commodity form is like the mode of the pervasive form through which exchange occurs at all. Similarly, like what would happen if we called labor power one of the essential resources we might be concerned with the organization of? Quite clearly, we get to talk about like relative or differential kinds of exploitation. We might even talk about exploitation as a phenomenon too core, but we probably won't get to unlocking the idea about abstraction at the core of like labor power as opposed to sort of just basic human activity. So what we don't really get is like pointers towards the critique of political economy. We simply get sort of like pointers towards distributional problems and like social problems in orientations towards the objects that exist within political economy as it exists now. I think it would be a stretch to assume that any theory of ideology just sort of hands us the entirety of the critique of political economy on its back, but it's at least curious that we can't really do some of the classic jobs that we want theories of ideology to do. Namely, I think, explain commodity fetishism, I think in a narrower sense, and potentially a sort of wider critique, whether in the form of something like real abstraction or like reification, like how this generalizes to the subjection and like extension of the logic of the commodity to other parts of the social world. And secondly, maybe something more about the institutional forms that regulate the reproduction of capitalism, where this story gives us something about like how like pernicious forms of stability might be encouraged, but not really how it's distinctively capitalist as such. Maybe we get that out of the theory of practice, maybe we don't, but I think that's up for grabs. So this, I think, is when we can turn to Joseph Rouse and his work, which has developed basically out of a number of concerns with the predominant strain in the philosophy of science and analytic metaphysics around particularly like Quinean pictures of naturalism, as well as representationalism. And so he's deeply indebted in parts of his project to Seller's critique of naturalism and a number of other sort of sources. I think Heidegger bears quite strongly into his thinking as well. He ends up producing out of this an orientation to turn away from object naturalism, sort of like the results and like products of scientific theorization are the things that we should stick to as the objects of concern for a theory of like any further philosophical reflection about that thinking. Towards what might be called a subject naturalism, like a naturalism of scientific practices and social practices. And this is how he ends up becoming a theorist of practice itself. And a theory that, like I said earlier, like very closely tacks towards where Brandom ends up as a theorist of practice. So the book that I take a lot of this from is like Fuzzy Knowledge and Power towards a political economy of science, political theory of science, and a very, very good précis of it, which comes in Engaging Science, a follow-up book. That throws up a bunch of different sort of descriptive criteria for what a practice is, two of which are the ones I want to concentrate on now, which I will just read. So firstly, the constitutive role of resistance and difference is a reason why the identity of a practice is not fixed by its history. That's why its constitutive pattern cannot be conclusively fixed by a rule. Practices are open to continual reinterpretation and semantic drift. And secondly, practices are not just patterns of action, but the meaningful configurations of the world within which actions take place intelligibly. And thus, practices incorporate the objects they are enacted with and on, and the settings in which they're enacted. What we get here is effectively a pointer towards things that Rouse can do with a theory of practice that Haslanger could not, specifically because she is a paid-up Quinean. She explicitly says that it would be better if social theory had more Quinean holism, Quinean naturalism, and along with it, her particular kinds of sort of like kind realism and semantic externalism. It forces objects, like the objects of practice in this case, to be effectively like objects given to us by scientific theorizing or like our engagement with the natural world, which don't then get retransformed by social practice. Whereas Rouse is particularly interested in the ways that practices engage with their objects and transform them through whether like the material change of practices, like finding new ways of intervening upon the world, or the sort of like normative like responsivity within the practice, changing how terms are used, changing how concepts are deployed, and therefore changing the sort of like semantics of the object, even if we don't like intervene directly upon it. I think both are important aspects here. You can think of a simpler object like an electron, for example, might be a case in point where the nature of electron changes depending on whether historically we've arrived at the point where we're simply treating as a sort of a point particle charge that can move through a wire versus something you can fire at a diffraction grating and get patterns out. The engagement that we have in the object and our sort of practical orientation to it transforms our idea of the object, our concept of the object, and fundamentally what the object is capable of doing for us. So with that, we get effectively a way to answer the question of like, okay, how can we talk intelligibly about something like the functions of ideology using this theory of practice rather than Haslanger's? And I want to use commodity fetishism as a sort of like toy example. I think it's probably our most productive. So practices seem to disclose both their sort of like operation and their sort of normative force, their like ability to reflexively like manage the bounds of what is or isn't successful within the practice simultaneously. This seems to be just characteristic of how Rouse understands practice. Like the world pushing on our practices happens just at the same moment that the practice is operating. In this sense, we sort of get a very, very clean analogy towards the commodity form, where we have something like in exchange the disclosure of the like moment or the creation of equivalence in the act of exchanging, and the normativity and the binding of us into understanding the object as something that successfully has been made equivalent happens in the moment where exchange is successful. The practice operates, but also the normative bounds that tell us that like that was a successful practice, more practice should be coordinated with this one, happen in the same moment. I don't think this is something special to Rouse's account of practice. I don't think we've we've arrived at some like amazing, like stunning coincidence here, but rather that this is the formal character of practices themselves. It just like shows that we're on the right track, that like any practice that like requires validation and judgment in its outcomes is going to look a lot like Rouse's account of practice, and the moment of exchange is one of them. The like enclosure of the commodity form is one of them. At the same time, this is where the sort of like intransigence of the object starts to sort of point to where the like contradictions of capitalism might be like observed within the system of practice. Like the commodity clearly encloses equivalence at the same time as like material disequivalence. And this is where like the object itself starts to push back. Like, what are we forgetting in the moment of making equivalent? We're forgetting the sensuous quality of the object. And that intransigence might be something that like puts pressure on the form. So that's not something that is like neatly given to us. Again, this is something where like the formal capacities of Rouse's account like give us ways of talking about this, give us a new language maybe for talking through the nature of the commodity, but doesn't like grant us new insight necessarily. What we do just seem to observe empirically though is that like the commodity forms a very successful stabilization of this intransigence. Like we do seem to be able to like produce practices that are coordinated around commodity exchange very successfully without the sort of intransigence of the object, like our missing of its sensuous dimensions, entering in and causing too much havoc. It clearly does. It's clearly not neither total nor something that's utterly stable. But we have a model here of a practice that is open, revisable, like subject to the sort of normative dimensions of its own activity, but still, for the moment, stable. And so, what I want to call this is that what I want to say about this is that the production of capitalism's abstracta, things like the commodity, value, money, involve a distinctly ontological kind of transformation. That's to say that like what happens in the course of a practice is the coordination of an object, which according to thesis 8 here, is something that's incorporated into the practice. It's something that is revised and constituted through the operation of the practice, and is only going to be workable if it's the appropriate kind of object to make that practice stable and reproducible. We have to produce the right kinds of objects to make these practices work, and the right kinds of either conceptual slippages or physical transformations of the things we do with each other have to happen to make these objects come about. And I think that sort of bears to some degree on a debate which has sort of like been simmering slightly in the background of a number of different like philosophical treatments of concepts like reification, which is whether reification is something like an epistemic thesis, something like a conceptual move, or a conceptual mistake, or is ontological. And so from a Ray Brassier article, Concrete in Thought, Concrete in Act, he posits this sort of like distinction that I want to pick at slightly, which says, in his words, Marx's critique of reification epistemological, not ontological. The distinction between living and dead labor is not a metaphysical contrast between authentic or inauthentic experience, or between lived and represented experience. It is a formal contrast between unconscious practice and conscious practice, between unvalidated practice and socially validated practice. And so I want to agree to the first part, that the difference between living and dead labor is not something that can be given by the sort of like sensuous nature of the thing, like by authenticity or inauthenticity. I would not want to go to a Heideggerian register to talk about the contrast between the two. However, like calling this merely epistemological when we've got the formal character described in terms of practice, I think starts to become slightly dicey. The difference between involvement in different kinds of practices is whether the object is produced in such a way that it's able to be sort of workable within those practices. And I would call that a quite distinctly ontological transformation. Objects that enter into the commodity form have to be a different kind of object in order to make this process work. And sort of on the other side of the debate, if there is one, is Michael J. Thompson, who does this in terms of reification, splitting its sort of subjective and objective sides. He says reification is an ontological category because it shapes and affects the self, the individual's capacities for thought, reflection, perception, libidinal motivation, and so on. So far, so like cognitive and subjective. But it also shapes the practices and social relations that are instantiated by them, thereby helping them to form the way the social world, indeed social reality itself, is shaped. I would almost want to go further than Thompson to say that it's not so much that the conscious elements transform the practices themselves. The practices themselves wouldn't ever get going, like the core acts of exchange, but also the sort of spilling out into other parts of the social realm, wouldn't happen if the objects weren't of the appropriate sort. And therefore, I think we sort of get it quite naturally, like consciousness and our conceptual orientation towards these objects being transformed in order to make sense of this system in which like the commodity dominates. Yeah, okay. So that's the sort of ontological claim I want to make. How long have I got? Cool, I've got 8 minutes. The step I want to go now was like, what's so bad about ideology? Haslanger very simply says it's when ideology is when our sort of valuation systems go wrong. And that seems to be obviously right. Like practices are things where normative considerations enter into them. And I don't want to make the sort of like distinction between thick and thin forms of normativity. Like we come into practices with a bunch of normative considerations, whether they're ethical, scientific, or sort of like epistemological values that we can carry with us, ways we want to be oriented towards each other, towards objects in the world. And those bear into the sorts of normative bounds and responses that we talk about as ordinary points of responsivity. And I think that's entirely right. Like we don't demarcate like, okay, there's the realm of making judgments about the practice. And then there's also the separate kind of normativity that's just the sort of negotiating of the sort of bounds of the practice. I think they are basically the same thing. And there's no point differentiating between the two. And what is the case though is reification or fetishism as a thesis points us towards other ways we might consider how to understand failures within a theory of ideology through the theory of practice. So practices are these norm-guided reflexive activities where the responsive nature of them is determined by like all the activity happening among both people and the sort of intransigent objects we're dealing with, more or less intransigent objects. But the nature of the commodity fetish, the nature of reification, is to attribute normative force to places outside of human activity. And that points us to not like some kind of like ethical failure, but rather to a failure to understand the formal character of practice itself. We understand practice to be reflexive, but sometimes practices appear to us as if they're not. And that seems to be a failure of like normative, of understanding the normative nature of practice. So with ideology, we can treat in some form, maybe not all, but at least in some form, as the movement of normative force outside of the bounds of practice to sort of like external objects. We start to get a sort of reproduction of the sorts of things that ideology talk in other domains and other theorizations gets to talk about, whether this is a thesis about reification or indeed like the production of the sorts of objects that we call ideological in everyday practice. Returning to something I said earlier, like the sort of smuggled quantitative slip doesn't seem to be quite so problematic in this case, because the objects of concern seem to be both quantitative and qualitative. Like if we're thinking in terms of real abstraction, something that's quite important to real abstraction is that they encode only quantitative difference. It's the nature of the sorts of abstractions themselves. But there are a whole host of other abstractions that aren't, of other social practices that are not dealing explicitly with capitalist abstractions like value, like labor power. They're instead things like, I'm thinking of something like Stuart Hall's Policing the Crisis, like mugging, highly ideological object, but clearly encoding a vast amount of like conjuncturally specific, historically specific trajectories and determinations. Something similarly like sex, the sort of like calcification of sex as a concept requires all sorts of qualitatively specific and historically specific stuff, but doesn't reduce just the quantitative to be autonomous. So the sort of like locating of normative force in our objects instead of in our practices is something that seems to be problematic, whether or not we make the jump between the qualitative and quantitative. And I want to give a shout out to Amy Diath's forthcoming paper on two substantialisms for that line of thought. Slightly further on, and to conclude, what we also get out of this is the idea that like our practices, as they spill out into the entire social world, all the ways we're oriented toward everyday objects, like everyday interactions with other people, they're responsive to the sorts of abstractions that are at play in the sort of like production of elements prior to it, which gives us a sort of way of talking about the way that the commodity form might not be the model on which every single ideological process occurs, but starts to infiltrate other social forms and starts to make other practices responsive to it. Whether we're coordinating cats or organ donation or whatever it might be, the logic of the market isn't the thing, isn't the resource, the abstraction of the market isn't the resource of concern in that immediate practice, but it is something that is constitutively transformed by the fact that commodity productions hang in the background and structuring all the other constitutive parts of the practice, all the other objects that we have to play with. I think I don't have a snappy conclusion because this is a slightly soft presentation, but that is everything I wanted to say. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. You might not have heard because of the sound, but you did get a nice round of applause there.
Cheers. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions if there are any. I'll pass the mic to you. Okay.
So much. Hello, I really like your presentation, so thank you very much. I would raise two short questions. The first one is when you said that for you, probably it doesn't make sense to distinguish between a strong sense of nativity and a thinner or a stronger sense of normativity. But I think that contradicts your point before when you said that some practices are more common or more easily connected with commodity form. And I think that's the normative, strong sense of practices, and at least from a didactic point of view, I think it's important to acknowledge that. The second question is super quick. Is just to say, it seemed to me that you mentioned that practices are kind of reflexive actions that are non-guided. I mean, this seems to me a very impossible notion of practices, in the sense that any practice, I would say 90% of practice at least, are guided, if not by external rules, by a natural rule of your own, or your own conscious, even if it's reified or you know, devoted to ideology, as you very interestingly pointed out at the end. So thank you so much.
Cheers, thank you. Two really good questions. So I might actually want a tiny bit of clarification on the notion of like connected to the commodity form. I think I have a sense of what you mean. I just give you got a chance to just like explain what you mean about like things that being more or less easily connected to the commodity form.
I mean, on the first part of your presentation,
Yeah.
I think you made very clear, and at least for me, very interesting point, connecting some form of practices with the commodity form. And you were saying, you basically, if I understand it right, that these sort of practices, which tend to entail the commodity form and are related to some kind of economic activity, probably they are more easily identified than the other ones. Is that right?
Yeah, more easily identified as a struggle. I realize one thing I have to just commit to is there being something like philosophically understood about the problem of the commodity form, the problem of fetishism, that I just have to commit to. And that sounds like a sort of like special kind of like inserted normativity. I think the best answer to the question is just like, how does strong normativity like come about? Like, I agree. I sense a distinction between the two things. Like they seem to operate in different ways. But like, I think the only way that stronger senses of normativity like actually get applied is through the weaker forms. Like we might have this like theoretical judgment about the nature of practice being morally evil or like scientifically like whether it's destructive or unstable over long periods of time, whatever we want to cash out as our like the content of our Marxian analysis. But like the only ways we can do that are interventions upon practice. And those interventions come in the form of like engagement with those practices, not necessarily in the sort of like reformist way. I hope it doesn't offer a reformist sheen. But the intervention of the practice is either like placing barriers on it, or like discursively like talking about our judgments about it. Like the bearer of strong normativity is weak normativity within the practice. So I hope that sort of explains the way I conceive of it. And there's a sort of like Wittgensteinian like flavor to the way I think about it personally. I'm still struggling to be like the if there is a closeness, it is an accidental closeness between the form of the practice form, if I might like gloss it as such, and the commodity form, because I think like all the closeness is showing is that we're on the right track, like philosophically, rather than there's something like distinctive about the commodity form like matching up to our theory of practice. I don't know if I fully answered the question, but like that part about weak normativity is the only bearer of strong normativity we have is the sort of way I'd respond probably. Oh yeah, there was a second part about the non-guided nature of practice. Yeah. So yeah, there is I think this is just common to everyone trying to develop a theory of practice, that they want it to not merely be rule following behavior, but also don't want it to be mere regularity. And there has to be a middle ground here, which is that it is normatively bounded by the community, or I mean, Rouse is actually even more freeform about this. And this is actually the one significant distinction between Rouse and Brandon. Brandon, in Rouse's framing, attributes the community as the final arbiter of the successful practice. They're the like where judgment like rests ultimately. Where Rouse basically doesn't think there is a final arbiter, in which case practices are just things that people enter into in a completely open-ended way. You cannot bound it to a certain community, to a certain geography, to a certain temporal condition. But normativity is still in operation. Like people do stuff. If I go back to the, I cancelled the screen share. If I can quickly whip it back up.
Just to quickly interrupt, Alexis,
Yeah.
we're nearly on to the next session, and Thomas has got a question. So if you could just
Yeah. I'll wrap
brief
up.
comment and then make we'll keep your answer to Thomas's question a little
Yeah,
bit.
sure. But yeah, just to point to Rouse's quote here, like there are all sorts of things that do the work of normatively bounding a practice without it merely just bottoming out in rule following. So I mean, I'm sure people could conceptualize it for themselves as rule following, but like that's clearly only one part of the ways in which a practice is managed and bounded. That's how I'll answer the second one. Move on.
Okay, sorry if I hurried you
No
up.
worries at all.
Thomas, are you able to unmute to ask your question? And
I think so.
you've been gracefully given a little bit of time from Jack, so don't feel rushed.
Thank you very much. I'll keep it quite brief. So this is not exactly my field of study, and I am quite tired, so I might just be way off base here. But I'm just asking I think a simple clarificatory question. You were talking about how in I think it was Haslanger's work, ideology is used as a pejorative, and only really when things go wrong, so to say. And that just seems like a very unhelpful way of using ideology, especially if you want to get into, you know, an actual political project to try and change things. And so I'm just wondering, is that really, like, I feel like, I guess, how do you see that? And is that how you would use it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is very downstream of particularly Raymond Geuss's idea of a critical theory and the sort of taxonomizing of different people's concepts of ideology. I think it's a bad taxonomy to start with. I don't think that the people he attributes this like pejorative sense of ideology to like do actually hold that position. I certainly think it's an unworkable one. Like I take ideology to, I mean, this is something that, again, like the form of ideology is going to change historically, but like Althusser's idea of both of the imagined relation to the mode of production and the relations to production, but also that like for the service of the reproduction of capitalism, like it clearly is a bad thing, but like it's clearly not restricted to merely just like places where it goes wrong. Like it has a character which pervades, was connected to the stuff we're doing with all social practice. So I mean, like I could be generous and say that like ideology is just like we really should be talking about all social technes and then like look at the ones we're not unhappy with and like not really make a distinction and call one ideological, one not so. But I actually think that the thing we get out of moving towards something like Rouse's theory of practice is the knowledge that normativity just pervades all practice. We can't like sidle off like some versus others as like our targets of interest for like where normativity is entering into our practices and how they might impact them.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Cheers.
I'd ask a follow-up question, but I suppose there's no time for that.
I'll wait for you.
Jack has been very generous and saying go ahead. So
Nice.
Um,
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much. So that would exactly make me think that there is an, well, let's say an ideological aspect to all of our practices. And so to put it differently, even under socialism or whatever, you know, better than capitalism system you would see, I think there would still be ideological work, and there would still be ideology, and not only in a bad sense. I think we need to reckon with ideology as a part of getting into a better system, and not just as the reproduction of capitalism, but as a reproduction of the system of production that we are in or want to move to. And so it doesn't seem to me like it's only a bad thing, but also something we should harness for more positive things.
Yeah, absolutely. I just straight up agree. Like the there is always going to be that like reflexive, the like unconscious reflexive components of practice, as well as the process of conceptualizing for ourselves. Like that just doesn't go. Like that's like a formal part of the theory that I just like more or less don't think disappears when you move to different modes of production. In which case, like how we negotiate that, I think might drastically transform, because like what is reification if not a thesis about the production of that like consciousness about practices, or at least like that links relationship between like what a practice is and what kinds of consciousness it produces, and like a mode of production settles that and that relation. But like I don't think the project of like attending to like what the normative dimensions of practice are doing changes whatsoever. So yeah, I fully agree.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you again, Alexis. That's great.
Cheers.